Good afternoon, everyone. John Carlson here with the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. Happy spring. Great to have you with us today, and my great privilege and honor to welcome you to our event with Professor Jewett, entitled Science, Religion, and Society, Lessons from the U.S. Case. Professor Jewett is a historian who studies the intersection of religion and science, and we're really thrilled to have him with us today, speaking and also in virtual residence at the center this week. Before we get started, I wanted to bring your attention to our next event, which is taking place on Tuesday, April 20th, entitled Laid Bare, part of our Laid Bare series, Surveillance, Eugenics, and Personhood. It will feature a distinguished panel of guests to examine issues that the pandemic has laid bare, involving comorbidities, scarce medical sources, under-resourced healthcare systems. And we'll be thinking about these issues in light of concerns about disability, age, and race, which, as many of you know, have also been linked to eugenic ideologies. I think you'll agree that the life and death stakes of these issues is undeniable. You can find out more about these events at our website, csrc.asu.edu. Sarah is kindly posting that information into the chat right now, so you can learn about it and sign up already. Today's lecture is part of our Beyond Secularization project on religion, science, and technology in public life, an interdisciplinary initiative that's housed at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. I'm going to turn things over to Ben Herbert, who's an associate professor in the School of Life Sciences at ASU and also one of the co-directors of that project. He'll share more information about it and introduce our speaker, and we'll get this conversation going with Professor Jewett following his talk. You will have an opportunity to post questions in the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar. I encourage you to go ahead and do that as soon as you have a question that you're prepared to ask. It helps the moderator queue up and review the questions as well. Another thing that helps the moderators, if you can keep your questions kind of succinct, they can get right to the meat of it and also organize questions together. So we're really glad to have you with us today. And Ben, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Thank you very much, John. So let me just briefly say a word about the project of which Professor Jewett's lecture is part. So I lead this project, the Beyond Secularization project, together with my co-PIs Gaiman Bennett and Hava Tirosh Samuelson. And the project is supported with the funded with the generous support of the Templeton Religion Trust. So the Beyond Secularization project seeks to explore the interrelations between religion, science, and technology in public life, particularly as they bear upon commonly held conceptions of progress. We are seeking to better understand how a variety of communities and traditions conceive of those interrelations, including actually the very categories themselves of science, technology, and religion. But these are not fixed concepts and categories. They're categories that we think with, that we, in a sense, shape in public discourse and public imagination. The boundaries between them may harden in some moments and break down in others. So for instance, when strict lines get drawn between religious and secular perspectives in public deliberation around ethical issues related to advances in science and technology, or when self-described Silicon Valley technology evangelists offer visions of technological futures that are inflected with ideas of spiritual enlightenment. So our research, the project itself, focuses on three primary areas: how advances in biotechnology are perturbing notions of what it means to be human and how those perturbations are being contended with, how notions of human flourishing and spiritual progress have shaped and been shaped by digital and information technologies and the kind of milieus in which they have been produced, and how religious visions figure in environmental aspirations to a better futures and in the ways of thinking about human relations to nature and human relations to each other that are at stake. We examine how ways of thinking about and doing, importantly, science, technology, religion, and secularism interact to shape these ideas and with what effect. So, as should be clear, this project approaches science, technology, and religion as very much situated in public life and is imbued with ideas of what makes for good lives and societies. And it seeks to open these up to forms of questioning and deepened reflection that, in our view, will be good for all of us. So today we are privileged to have with us a scholar who, in my view, has done some of the most interesting and pioneering work in this vein. Andrew Jewett is currently the Martha Daniel Newell Visiting Scholar at Georgia College and will soon be the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Distinguished Visiting Professor of Ethics and Leadership at the University of Houston's Hobby School of Public Affairs. He taught at Harvard for a decade, spent the last 3 years at Boston College, and previously held positions at Yale, NYU, and Vanderbilt. He's held fellowships from the National Humanities Center, the Cornell Society for the Humanities, the National Academy of Education, and the American Academy for the Arts and Sciences. Professor Jewett is a historian of the politics of knowledge and engagements between religion and science, including the social sciences, and American public life. His first book, I will advertise these because in my view, these are excellent books. His first book, Science, Democracy, and the American University, explored the cultural and political hopes that many American scholars invested in science from the 1860s to the 1950s, in particular, the idea that bringing science into public life and into higher education and so forth could make more ethical citizens. His most recent book is Science Under Fire, a really excellent book that I highly recommend to you. Science Under Fire: Challenges to Scientific Authority in Modern America. It's an exceptionally timely book for a moment in which worries about post-truth and anti-science politics are at a peak. What it does is it locates those in a much longer history, exploring how suspicion of science, which is far from a recent development in American politics, has actually been a major force in American politics and culture for a century, and how the defenders and critics of science have variously hailed from both right and left. So today, I believe Professor Jewett will speak to issues that he has explored in much greater depth in his book. And I, for one, am greatly looking forward to the talk. I will now turn it over to you, Professor Jewett. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm really glad to be there with you all, if only virtually. I don't know if I'm there or here, if I want to use the right metaphor. Okay, as we all witnessed, two crises that had long been brewing came to a head in the US in 2020 and have continued to dominate headlines in the new year. One of these, of course, has to do with the persistence of subtle, entrenched forms of racial discrimination, even overt white supremacy. And the other one's about how science and expertise should figure in our collective political decisions. Now, the debate about race in the US as it's unfolded in media and politics has often actually been conducted in pretty sophisticated terms. Some nuanced interpretations that you used to find only among scholars and some activists are now circulating among fairly broad audiences. Arguments about science and expertise have often remained cartoonishly simple. Slide here. Often they just boil down to this single prescription: follow the science, right? Not the politics. We see this injunction over and over and over and over again in one form or another. Slide. Sometimes you can find more complex approaches. Here are a couple of starting points, including one that Ben was involved in. I recommend these. But usually the language is much more simplistic. Slide. And it's important to note, too, that critics of the policies that we usually consider scientific also try to enlist science on their side. So we get the same mantra from critics of mask mandates, business closings, remote learning, even vaccination, as from the advocates. Slide. And of course, we see this in many controversies unrelated to the pandemic as well, here on the question of trans rights. The implication, though, is clear, and in any of these cases, no law or policy can reverse what nature has wrought and science has discovered. Slide. Now, meanwhile, those who acknowledge that these difficult decisions are inescapably political still often describe them in ways that reinforce this sharp distinction between science and politics. Still science on one side, politics on the other, but maybe you have to balance them instead of choosing between them. And we continue to see another deeply entrenched dichotomy all around us as well between science and religion. This distinction, of course, has long been foundational to Western thought, goes back centuries, right, in some forms. And each of these two dichotomies really has a long and distinguished lineage. You find them in various forms going back at least to what we used to call the scientific revolution. Slide. And these are just two of the many interpretive frameworks that have long been used to distinguish science from other human pursuits, all kinds of different reasons along lots of different axes. Slide. But for the purpose of this talk, let's stick with these two that I've mentioned: science versus politics, science versus religion. I'm going to start by looking briefly at what these two dichotomies have in common. Of course, they don't refer to exactly the same thing, but they're closely related to one another in some important ways. Then I'm going to look at part of how it came to be the case that these distinctions are so familiar, so taken for granted, and so intuitively compelling to most people. I'll be drawing here, as Ben said, on this new book, Science Under Fire, looking at the case of the 20th century US in particular. I'm going to give you some of the figures I discuss in the book from a couple of key moments, the 1920s and the 1950s. And then I want to step back again and ask where we might go from here. If these dichotomies between, again, science over here, politics and religion over there are misguided, as more and more critics are now arguing, what kinds of alternative frameworks might be available? And I want to consider a couple of possible avenues forward. But let's start with the common threads between these two dichotomies, science versus politics and religion. Often these are seen as two specific cases of a more general distinction between science and values. Science can't tell us what to value. It can't sort between potential values. And there's an interesting backstory here. Slide. If you look at the history of this term values itself, it's often related to attempts to define what science is not. Okay? This growth you see here in the late 1920s, it's not necessarily an uptick in discussions of this issue, how science relates to religion, politics, and so forth, although there's some of that. A lot of what you're seeing here is this new meaning of the term values, which was often connected to these discussions of science. In the 19th century, it's mostly associated with economics, right? The values of various goods. But in the early 20th century, many commentators began to use this as a kind of catch-all category for all of the things scientific inquiry was said to exclude, right? This list we saw earlier, politics, religion, philosophy, art, and so forth, all put together in that category of values when science was distinguished from them more sharply than it had been in earlier years. All right, so what do all of these pursuits that are lumped, that are lumped under the heading values have in common? One way to think about them is to see them as expressions of human subjectivity. They embody subjective preferences, or perhaps exertions of the will, subjective choices to act in one way and not another. So products of the human mind, but not its capacities for reason and logic. Slide. Another way to think about science and values is to distinguish scientific statements from normative ones. Science isn't normative, it doesn't tell you what to do. In this classic formulation, typically associated with David Hume, right, you can't get from a statement of is to a statement of ought. Slide. You also see this in a more 20th century idiom. You can think about normativity this way: science only provides if-then statements. Not in the computer sense of taking a certain action only if a kind of trigger condition is met, but in the sense that science can only tell us if we want to achieve a certain goal, then we should act in this way. Slide. All right, now why do we think of science in these ways? For this talk, I'm not really interested in the question of why many working scientists and philosophers of science adopt these views. I want to look at the broader question. How did so many of the rest of us come to take these dichotomies for granted? When did these tightly bounded views of science emerge, and why? It's not, I would say, just because scientists and their philosophical allies told us that that was true. Many of them did. And historians have looked a great deal at those claims, arguing that there are key means by which scientists build up their power and prestige, and protecting their own views from criticism along the way. But if you step back and think about it for a minute, it's not necessarily obvious that the best way for a group to enhance its power and its prestige is to insist that its work bears no relation to what other members of society value most highly. In fact, that's a pretty good way to provoke suspicion or even charges of disloyalty. Historians of McCarthyism after World War II have noted that scientists were especially likely to be targeted by anti-communists, and argue in this book that this is just one example of a much broader pattern of suspicion that stretches across much of the 20th century and right up to our own time. The suspicion that science represented a clear and present danger, an alien cultural presence. Some of that suspicion reflected what I just described, scientists' own proclamations of neutrality with respect to prevailing values, positioning themselves outside the culture. But that's only part of the story. Many critics of science also work to position it outside the culture. So a lot of my book explores how members of other groups sought to limit the power and prestige of scientists during the 20th century, or at least to confine that authority within narrow constraints, to insist that scientists could only interpret the non-human parts of nature, not the world of human action. I don't focus in the book on fundamentalists and other theological conservatives who rejected a key part of the natural sciences, modern evolutionary biology. I'm concerned with a much wider circle of figures who embraced the natural sciences, but insisted that understanding ourselves, not our bodies perhaps, but our behavior in scientific terms, could destroy humanity. And up through the 60s, I argue, in many cases well beyond, one of the main ways that these critics sought to hem in science, to set these limits to its power and its prestige, was to insist on its neutrality with respect to prevailing social and political values, to say science bears no relation to what we really care about, either individually or collectively. It tells us nothing meaningful about ourselves. Science can't tell us what to do in a normative sense. It can't even explain why we do what we do, because its narrow interpretive lens doesn't see the moral purposes that guide us. The scientific viewpoint only applies to the non-moral processes elsewhere in nature. And so I argue in the book that these kinds of critics did a great deal to establish the familiar view of science as a rigorously value-neutral pursuit. You can go back for a second to the previous slide, that'd be great. So I packed a bunch of complicated points in the last couple of minutes. I want to go back through and explain them at greater length with some concrete illustrations. Let me just start with the 1920s and set the scene for a second. This is where the book begins, with the rise of a new kind of argument about science's cultural impact. And there had always been people who viewed science as a potential threat. So take the response to Darwinism after 1859. Right? Lots of religious leaders and other folks say, if we start to see ourselves the way Darwin sees us, society is going to unravel. It's going to undermine these foundational assumptions in our culture. But the 1920s seemed to make that threat much more immediate. There were a lot of social changes going on in the US after World War I. The emergence of a modern consumer culture plays a major role here, a new obsession with machines and gadgets, changes in education, more schooling overall, more secular education, and widespread popular interest in the social sciences after World War I, especially psychology, both Freudian and other forms. And you start to get small groups of critics looking around and saying, oh, a scientific culture is here. Now we're living in a scientific world, a world structured by scientific views of the human person. This threat has become a reality. Now we're taking our cues from the scientists, and as a result, we've lost our moral bearings. We've become literally demoralized, right? Not in the sense of lacking the will to go on, the usual meaning of that word, but shorn of our moral compass, because science told us that we were animals, or we were machines, or we were predictable, rather than moral beings. Right? An age of science has dawned, and we've lost our morality. So this is a common thread through much of the book, especially from the 20s up through the 1960s. This assertion of science's neutrality is tied up with this kind of narrative about cultural change, right? Starting point, science eliminates moral considerations from whatever it studies. Then we've come to think scientifically about human beings. That's the next major step in the argument. And therefore, we no longer acknowledge human morality. Okay, next slide. A few examples of this kind of narrative from the 1920s. I want to start with this group called the New Humanists. This is a prominent group of critics led by these two on the left, Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer Moore. They argued that human beings had a lower nature and a higher nature, and civil order depended on the subjugation of the lower by the higher. But by the 20s, they thought what they called a naturalist conspiracy against civilization had taken hold of the culture. And particularly in psychology, this central field for defining who we are and how we act, no longer acknowledged the higher self because it couldn't be seen in the laboratory. Now, as I said, Babin and Moore are the big names here, but they had a resident science expert who spelled out the view of science that anchored their arguments. Slide. And that's Moore's younger brother, Louis Trenchard Moore, here. He's a physicist, he's an historian of science, teaches at the University of Cincinnati. He wrote biographies of Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, as well as this book on the limitations of science that you can see there. And he says here, science means mechanistic explanation, right? And this doesn't apply to any domain in which the human mind is a factor. There, you need a non-scientific approach, okay? Now, critics didn't always offer this kind of explicit, systematic definition of science. Mostly, they just took it for granted that it was morally neutral, and then they moved immediately to lamenting its cultural effects. But in a way, that made the claim of neutrality more powerful, because it didn't even acknowledge the possibility of debate. Science simply was neutral with regard to moral purposes. That had to be the starting point for anyone thinking about its meaning and applications. Slide. This is true for many of the religious critics who agreed with the New Humanists that there was this naturalist conspiracy against civilization. I'm going to focus here on Protestant commentators, given their cultural prominence, starting with a figure some of you will recognize, Reinhold Niebuhr. In the 1920s, he's just starting to articulate the neo-orthodox critique of liberal Protestantism, for which he became famous, but his critique of the cultural effects of science is well developed from the start. This is his first book, you see, Does Civilization Need Religion? And he says civilization is threatened by both science and its technological offshoots. In the case of science, the extension of its mindset had fueled this relentless depersonalization of civilization, as he wrote. And as a result, you get these just ruthless struggles for power, with most people just sitting on the sidelines, just trying to maximize their pleasure. Slide. Those in the mainstream of liberal Protestantism sometimes offered a similar critique despite their friendliness to the natural sciences. So a liberal Congregationalist minister named John Wright Buckham became a particularly strong critic of scientific views of the human person. And he says, psychology used to be a respectable and harmless department of philosophy, and now it's just this flood washing over the modern world, right? Teaching people that they act in a purely mechanistic fashion. And these kinds of scientific interpretation didn't just clash with the content of traditional moral principles, they eliminated the very possibility of moral freedom, free will, the choosing self. And he says even natural scientists reject this. Slide. You keep moving to the left, as it were, on the theological spectrum, self-proclaimed religious modernist Chandler Matthews. If you know the history of the Scopes trial and the anti-evolution movement, he's a leading target of the fundamentalist critics. He embraces Darwinism and so forth, says modernism is part of the scientific struggle, but he says the modernist joins hands with the fundamentalist in rejecting this view of humanity, right? Again, that leaves sheer animal pleasure as the only driving force. Slide. All right, let's move ahead to the 1950s. Now, by then, this narrative of demoralization had become extremely common. More and more commentators portraying modern culture in this way. And since the 1930s, this analysis had intersected with the ideological struggle against totalitarianism, so that many in the US now argue that both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were products of this demoralization wrought by science. You have a whole series of additional social changes after World War II that again convinced new groups of critics that science has sort of taken charge. More consumerism, more suburbanization, more educational change, more interest in psychology, new developments, permissive parenting, opinion polling, bureaucratization, suburban conformity. For many commentators, all of that reflected the cultural influence of science, this stance of neutrality, this portrayal of human beings in non-moral terms. Slide. So here's the historian Jacques Barzun looking back from 1964 on the post-war period and a little before, this period, right, that we consider the golden age of American science, when you had these big research budgets with very little oversight, when scientists enjoyed new kinds of cultural and political authority. That's all true, but this was hardly unchallenged. And Barzun says again and again, right, science has been said to remake the social world in this depersonalized, demoralized way. There's a kind of national reckoning after World War II with science's cultural meanings, and the judgment is often quite critical. Slide. So you get this kind of criticism from all over the place. Let's catch up with Reinhold Niebuhr. Again, in the 1950s, he publishes his big book, The Irony of American History, 1952. And he argues, again, culture, although not, fortunately, not politics in his view, and this is an unusual caveat. He says, American culture is dominated by a mechanistic scientism that denies moral freedom and sin. Scientific cultures can't acknowledge anything that lies outside causal sequences. And he says the remaining 20th century ideologies, Marxism and secular liberalism, share this faulty reliance on science as a tool for understanding the human world. In fact, he says the United States differs from the Soviet Union mainly in the fact that it had refused to hand over direct power to the social scientists. Slide. I'll turn here to the Jewish writer Will Herbert. He's known for this 1955 book, Protestant Catholic Jew, which announces the kind of mainstreaming of Catholics and Jews as good Americans. But he's also a ferocious critic of secular culture. And he says Western civilization has utterly collapsed because Westerners have wrongly extrapolated from the natural sciences, and all value has therefore been squeezed out of the world, right? And you need a postmodern outlook that recovers traditional religion. Slide. One of Herbert's frequent sparring partners, Rabbi Robert Gores, says the turn from religion to science has brought what he called an age of dissolving standards and vanishing values, the collapse of international morality, and the wholesale decline of moral standards at home. It's not just that moderns flouted moral standards, they refused to believe they were even possible, total nihilism. And note the language here, science is, as he puts it, fundamentally amoral. This statement that you see here could have been written by any number of scientists at the time. This is precisely the terms in which they asserted their own neutrality, but Gores is drawing that sharp boundary from the other side, right? To say moderns must look to religion in their search for ethical guidance. We look at political commentators, slide. We can see these kinds of arguments on all sides after World War II. On the right, Whittaker Chambers in Witness, Stalinism comes right out of the physics textbook, right? It's not Marx. Slide. On the political left, Dwight McDonald, the editor of the journal Politics, he says, well, the traditionalist conservatives have it partly right. We have to reject these visions of scientific culture, of science-driven progress. Radicals, too, must begin their analysis with the human person. Slide. We also see this kind of argument among many leading natural scientists and administrators. So here's James B. Conant, president of Harvard, steps away to oversee the Manhattan Project during the war, and he constantly decries these extrapolations from natural science to the human beings. Scientific analysis, he says, misses the spiritual basis of individual freedom. Slide. In some quarters, you start to get a new kind of argument. It's not entirely new, but it's more visible, spreading more widely after World War II. Scientists claim to be neutral. They might try to be neutral. They can't. No neutrality is possible. This is James A. Pike. He's a leading Episcopalian. And he says everybody has a worldview that shapes everything they do, including their investigations of the world around us. They shape how we see our data. You can't be neutral. You have to choose. And he presents two choices, religion or secularism. Slide. And you see this stark choice over and over and over again after the war. Whether science really is neutral or whether it just pretends to be neutral, you have to choose between it and traditional religion. Where would you look for guidance? This is Claire Booth Luce, who was married to the magazine publisher Henry Luce. She converted to Catholicism in a highly public way and then went into politics. And she here frames the choice as a matter of competing prayers, right? Do you pray to God, or do you pray to these destructive forces unleashed by modern science and its materialistic outlook? Slide. So the book traces this tradition of criticism through the late 20th century, when it took on some new and very different forms. Among other things, the idea that there can be no genuine neutrality spread more widely. But let me step back from the history again. I'd be happy to talk about that later period in the Q&A, but let me ask instead, where do we go from here? How should we think about science in relation to politics and religion? There is a growing tendency among many disciplines to push back against these dichotomies. So you'll hear many scholars say, well, any given form of science is shot through with social and political values, right? It's a product of social contexts. Or you'll hear critics argue that science and religion don't conflict, they actually harmonize. Or that many of the phenomena we consider secular and thus scientific are actually religious in character. There are important truths in each of these lines of criticism, but I also think we need to frame them more precisely. Slide. And so in the interest of moving towards that, let me take a stab at some suggestions of my own. I want to make 3 points here. First two of them I think are pretty sensible, although they're still often forgotten and worth spelling out. And one would be to adopt what I think of as a kind of neo-neutralism with respect to this question of science and values. The old neutralism, right, says science is totally isolated from values. Neo-neutralism could say that science is never found in isolation from structures of value, but it's not always the same values. Endorsing science doesn't necessarily mean endorsing a particular kind of high modernist technocratic sensibility in which every facet of our lives is dominated by a kind of soulless instrumental rationality. And of course, there was science in Nazi Germany. There was science in the Soviet Union under Stalin. There was science in the medieval church. There has been and there will be science in many other kinds of social settings as well. There are certain features of science that I think rule out a couple of kinds of value systems, but it is compatible with a remarkably broad range of social and cultural forms, as well as religious traditions. Slide. Second suggestion, I think it's important to avoid what we could call the duopoly model of science and religion. We often see this assumption that the whole world of human thought and culture can be divided into scientific and religious phenomena. Okay, that duopoly, that these two entities monopolize the field between them. Now, we could just reject the idea of a clear boundary, but what I want to challenge is the deeper assumption that you can put every aspect of thought and culture into maybe one or both of those categories. There are lots and lots of systems of thought and practice that are neither scientific nor religious. They're secular, if that means non-religious in some sense, but they're not scientific. And we could find all sorts of examples just looking around: discourses of law, bureaucracy, capitalism, consumerism, journalism, education, clearly not scientific. And then on the other side, to say that they're religious stretches the meaning of that category to the point where I think it becomes pretty much useless. Science and religion don't monopolize the field of thought. All right, third and final point. This one is pretty speculative and probably controversial. I'm really not entirely sure whether I'm committed to this, and if so, quite how. I taught a big course on science and religion for many years, and I try to give my students a bit of a shock on the first day to get them thinking in new ways. And I would say, well, here are some of the ways that people have tried to define the relationship between science and religion. And I would go through the various models that have been proposed: conflict, independence, dialogue, integration. And I would say you can't actually answer this question. There is no relationship between science and religion because there is no such thing as either science or religion. They don't exist. Okay? Now, of course, I'm not referring to the actual phenomena that get labeled science or religion. Obviously, those exist. But I was trying to get them to consider the possibility that these big sweeping categories might, for a lot of purposes, obscure more than they reveal. Now, in relation to science, a lot of academic interpreters have just given up on what's called the demarcation problem, finding some kind of definition that applies to everything we consider science and nothing we don't. Most of us now adopt a more historicist approach. We look at how the category has been applied over time. There have been similar moves among scholars of religion, especially insofar as they've come to recognize the distinctively Christian provenance and application of the prevailing definitions of religion. So what should we do? Can we just stop using these terms, science and religion, completely and just refer to specific systems? So could we just say genetics or Hinduism without using broader categories? Maybe there's something to be said for that. It's hard to pull off in practice, right? Even setting aside cultural inertia and all the work that these categories do, our Constitution talks about religion. Other institutions invoke the category of science. What if we just pluralize the terms instead and talked about sciences and religions, plural? You'd still have some problems, obviously, of demarcation, definition, but we could start moving toward a level of specificity that would help us understand our world better and act in it more effectively and responsibly. Because these big abstract claims about science is this and religion is that, and here's the relationship between them, don't tell us a whole lot about how to act when we face specific issues related to science or associated forms of technology. Think of vaccines, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, reproductive technologies. Particular theories and practices interact in divergent and highly specific ways with the values of various individuals and groups. Some of those are values we would call religious, many others are simply social. So if we think of the long history of coerced sterilization and medical experimentation inflicted on racialized groups in the US, but even if the group we're talking about is a religious group, say Catholics, I don't think there's really any point at which a blanket claim about science, religion, and a relationship between them does a whole lot to help us understand the particular contours of an issue or a controversy. What matters are really the particulars themselves, right? We're not looking there at religion in the round, even if we could somehow generalize about, say, all Catholics, and we're not looking at science or technology in the round. So I want to argue that there's a strong case for bracketing at least these high-level generalizations and just focusing on what's in front of us, right? Instead of trying to find a general principle that we can apply to all new cases, let's just look at the cases on their own terms. There's no aspect of science and technology that will provoke the same response from all religious people. And likewise, no religious group, no matter how narrowly you define it, will respond in the same fashion to every one of the things that gets called science, right? If these categories obscure the variations and the particularities, maybe we should start to consider how we use them. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on all of these suggestions, and I'm, of course, glad to answer questions about any of the material from the book as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Jewett, for a very rich and provocative lecture. I hardly know where to enter that because that's such a kind of enormous configuration, and that's sort of central to our culture, so central that we're sort of unaware of it, I think, that it's hard to know where to start by taking a bite at the apple. But here's the question that I want to ask to just sort of start off our conversation. So, excuse me. So number one, on your third junction, the pluralize.
Yeah.
To sort of swing back to where you began your talk, the politics that has emerged, not only in the last 12 months, but very prominently in the last 12 months, has been about following the science, not following this school of epidemiology that's drawing upon this model to make this particular claim, which, of course, if one looks closely at that school of epidemiology, there are disagreements at the margins, and there's always sort of an interpretive unsettlement, even if from the outside things look settled. And of course, that is what one would see if one looks more deeply inside of the institutions that house science. But for that matter, so too law vis-a-vis religion, or indeed religion itself, et cetera, et cetera. And yet these categories do work for us in thinking through what are the ways in which we should be together as a polity, what should be privatized, what is public, what can be presumptively held in common, and so forth. And you've written about the place of science in the university as a sort of project of civic education. So I wonder if you would just say some comments about that. If we were in a moment in which civic education is needs to be renewed, and surely there won't be much disagreement about that. What are the ways in which we ought to approach it? In the ways we think about education itself, it's the sort of pedagogical projects, but also in the organization of the institutions which people are meant to inhabit and in some respects absorb, mirror themselves in the ways in which these sort of large categories have or haven't built into the configuration of, well, the university, but other institutions that are responsible for in a sense, performing for people the right landscape of knowledge, of reason, and of sort of allocations of responsibility and authority in American democracy.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because we've had these recurring debates over science education itself, through the 20th century, and you constantly find scientists saying it doesn't tell people how science works, it doesn't present any kind of reasonable picture about how you would go about becoming a scientist. And if you see, look in kids' textbooks, of course, there's these little recipe scientific methods, right? You have 5 or 6 or 7 or however many number of steps, and you follow them, and it's it sort of churns out knowledge. There have been all these different attempts to teach it in other kinds of ways. But what generally reasserts itself is the provision of a certain body of content so that people are then eligible to, in a high school, then to go on and pick up college science, and then in college science to go on to graduate school and to be able to work in a field. So there's it's always focused on the provision of content. There have been a lot of people who wanted to talk about science in action. So James Conant, who I mentioned, was famous for helping to develop the field of history of science. And he says, well, let's look at how classical experiments worked and try to understand examples of scientific reasoning, right? Now, I have my doubts that any of those would change a whole lot the public conversation, because you've got, I don't know if you imagine this kind of Venn diagram, you've got a bunch of different social groups for whom the idea that science is this rigorously neutral process that's kind of set aside from all cultural matrices does a lot of work. You've got scientists themselves for whom this protects them from an enormous amount of criticism, right? Ensures a good deal of their funding. You've got all these kinds of critics I talked about. This sort of comes and goes at various times, this kind of mode of criticism, but there's an investment there among some people in saying that we need to look elsewhere for guidance. And then you've got all the politicians who I didn't talk about today, but people like Ted Porter have written about the way that science functions in US politics as this kind of backstop that politicians can dump decisions off onto the experts so that they don't have to take responsibility for making an act of what seems like arbitrary will, right? It serves to as this kind of trump card to sort of hold up and say, look, I didn't really make that decision, right? Nature made it for me in a sense, right? All of these intersect at this place where science is conceived as outside culture. And it's hard to imagine how to break that down. But you see, as you say, in this instance, you see a particular model of epidemiology being elevated into all of science, and then everything else scientific is just kind of swept in with that, right?
So in the spirit of opening up the conversation, I'm going to ask Sarah to come in and field some questions from the Q&A.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. What a great conversation. Attendees, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function in the webinar, and we will get to them as possible. So Ben, building off of your first question, can you talk a little bit about, Professor Jewett, can you talk a little bit about your understanding of the relationship between science and democracy, and what, if anything, that understanding does in helping us to negotiate different ways that science sort of imposes power and bears influence in public life, public problems, and the like?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a big question.
We'll just start it off high. Yeah.
Everything. Yeah. I mean, the first book, I talk a lot about the perceived relationship between science and democracy. And in many ways, that's the central theme of the second book as well, insofar as a lot of these critics were imagining that the kind of culture science produced could not sustain a democratic form of social life. And I look conversely in the first book at those who believe that science was a kind of model for democratic discourse. And I try to suggest that in a way they took a a lot of them took an idealized picture of a kind of deliberative democracy. They imagined that the scientific community was that, and then they said, look, science is a model for democracy, right? I mean, I don't want to make it sound quite so idiotic or sort of, or alternatively strategic, but there was this kind of conflation going on of how discourse ought to work in this kind of democratic imagination and how scientists actually functioned, which didn't match terribly well what scientists do in their daily lives. As far as a kind of normative relationship between them or a kind of institutional relationship, I mean, I probably want to defer to Ben on some of the more contemporary stuff and claim historians' ignorance. I think there are resources in science for learning how to argue well, but I think there are resources in a lot of other disciplines that can teach us many of the same lessons about how to argue well with one another and not to jump immediately to ad hominem attacks and so forth. And I don't think either that that's a full basis for a politics. I just think it's an important adjunct to several kinds of politics to make them work well. So I'm still trying to figure these out, partly through these kinds of studies.
Definitely. I'm curious too about your insight into this present moment. So now with politics, very polarized at the moment, with a lot of religious motivations for Americans coming to light, and in the midst of this COVID pandemic, how do you think that there's anything unique about this moment as people are trying to access science to make decisions about their day-to-day, as people are seeking solace and motivation in their religious convictions? How do you see those different dimensions sort of interacting for society today?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really fascinating because it's very hard to figure out. People are very clear on where they think science is and all of this, but it's very hard to figure out where they think religion is, right? I mean, there's religious communities are all over the map. I think there's a general sense that, white evangelicals are over here, at least on the vaccine question and some of the mandates and so forth. But it's been hard to make some of those broad level generalizations. It doesn't stop a lot of commentators from doing so. But I think it gives us some pretty unique opportunities to press on some of these sorts of generalizations. Maybe not successfully, but I think this moment opened in a sense with the Science March movement, right? March for Science, and the way that it conflated, mostly in ways I agree with the policies, but it really conflated scientific decisions with political decisions. I think this moment is accelerating, I hope, the kind of interrogation of that kind of easy assumption that what policy science is telling you to adopt, right? At the very least, you've got to import something like "if you want to live," right? But as Ben and others have written, there's even more complicated questions there about who decides, the locus of authority, the relationship of science to other sorts of constitutional norms, and so forth.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. The next two questions come from Dana and Roy. So, in spite of the problems presented by the belief that the dichotomy exists between science and religion, could science have developed and generated scientific knowledge without establishing itself separate from religion? And perhaps similarly, in terms of some of the different nuanced beliefs, depending on, commonly held religious views regionally, are Eastern religions more likely to be compatible with science than, say, Christianity?
Interesting. Yeah, people have argued some of those points over the long haul. I think I might refrain from taking a stand on the last one, just being much more of an expert in the sort of U.S. configurations. There are cases to be made for compatibility, I think, with different parts of science. And again, this is why I might want to disaggregate it with different kinds of religious traditions. Some of them comport more easily with particular pieces of science and others with other pieces of science. Did science have to distinguish itself? I mean, there's a way in which any institution has to attain a certain level of independence. I wouldn't say autonomy, but at least a certain level of definition in order to function according to fairly clearly defined rules, right? You could imagine, I don't think without any trouble, societies in which everyone continued to hold religious beliefs and practice science. I don't think that would be a contradiction in terms necessarily. So I don't think at the personal level of abandoning faith or belief, it is necessarily required. Now, as I said, though, there are certain forms of religious commitment that I think are very difficult to reconcile with some of the basic assumptions of at least what we would call modern science about the primacy of sensory evidence, or perhaps the sufficiency of sensory evidence, at least in certain domains, to kind of establish our claims. And so again, I don't think one could make a sort of generalized statement. I think most kinds of religion would not have to be jettisoned necessarily for the scientific enterprise to have become established as it has.
Wonderful, thank you. Ben, I'm going to bring you back on. Any final closing questions or closing thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, this is sort of an observation that's also a question. It's striking how the figures that you presented from, well, the 1920s, but especially the 1950s, are worrying over the ways in which there are competing accounts are given of who we are or what we are, and therefore what will that mean for how we live, et cetera, with the self-concept and its sort of ethical and political ramifications. Whereas, you know, in a sense, the troubles that we're contending with now are more about what we should do. The relationship, as you were pointing out, the presumed straightforward relationship between scientific knowledge and its sort of policy implications, a relationship which is sort of complex and troubled. So I wonder if you just reflect for us for a second, since you have a uniquely rich view of a sort of macro historical scale here, is that a transition that has happened? And number two, insofar as it has, whether completely or incompletely, what are the implications of that for the ways we think about science and religion as such, not domains in which there are worldviews in effect, but as institutional figures? So for example, one of the sites of conflict, you know, where the compatibility or incompatibility of science and religion has been sort of thrown open lately, is actually in the form of a kind of constitutional question about whether one's spiritual life is compatible or incompatible with one's public health existence. And in a sense, what ways of knowing citizens trump which, as you know, as you know, individuals holding a right to free exercise of religion, as individuals with obligations, and what modes of knowing those individuals are appropriate to contending with those matters of what we should do in political decision making.
Right. Yeah. No, those are excellent questions. I think on the first point, maybe one way to think about it is to say that the question of who we are, the locus of debate around that has largely shifted back away from the social sciences since the middle decades of the 20th century, back into the natural sciences with the rise of biotechnology and artificial intelligence and so forth. Those tend to be the fields that are generating the big who we are types of questions about the nature of the human. And so they're not as invested with some of the same kinds of institutional dimensions as some of the earlier conflicts were. I think there are a lot of things that happen after around 1970. A lot of the movements, a lot of the kinds of sweeping critiques of modernity abate for a while, although they come out in very different forms in that kind of discourse of postmodernism in the late 20th century. But they're invested with very different kinds of they're associated with different kinds of conflicts in the universities, for example, different kinds of stakes, even though they often take a similar form. So I think there are a number of different shifts. A lot of critiques of science become more politically specific from the 1960s forward, so they tend to be attached to specific political agendas in a way that the critiques of the post-war period were just enormously vague. They had very little content about what ought to be done, other than just following a different structure of cultural authority. They referred to institutions almost never. Now, the other question coming to institutions, I mean, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that if there's a conflict between our public health sort of being and our spiritual being, it is still the politicians that are deciding, right? They're deciding to defer in many cases. There are other actors, individual church leaders, right, that are deciding on different terms. But at the level of the politicians, they're still making the choice, right? So it is just that it's not that they're, it's that they're choosing to act like they're deferring, right? To act like they're really not deciding. And that's, of course, a problem throughout politics. People find millions of different ways to disavow responsibility, but that is a particularly powerful and a particularly prevalent one in the US, where we really struggle to talk about politics in terms of normative commitments or clashing value systems or any number of other things.
Thank you so much. So if I've got our choreography right, I would like to bring John back to close us out. But let me just say, Professor Jewett, thank you so much for a very, very rich lecture. And once again, let me recommend to the audience that there's much, much more of this in Professor Jewett's wonderful book, and I recommend it to you most highly.
Thank you.
We're getting John's video up. There we go.
To be invited back in and yet not to be able to come in. So anyway, thank you so much, Professor Jewett, for the really, really stimulating talk. Very accessible, very clear, very thought-provoking. Both gives us a sense of kind of the framing conceptual questions as well as a history. And of course, where do we go from here? How might we think about some of these problems, issues that you've raised in framing of religion and science as we think further, and particularly I think these questions as they bear upon what does it mean to think about science and to take these concerns in a democracy is so important in our time and in this pandemic mode that we're in. So thank you for giving us so much to think about. Sarah, I think you have a few closing comments, and then we'll sign off here. Thanks to our audience for joining us and for the great questions you put out there too, Professor Jewett.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I just want to echo gratitude to you, Professor Herbert and Professor Jewett and John Carlson for this talk. Attendees, thank you so much for watching through the webinar or through our live stream channels. What did you think? We would love to hear from you. We have a feedback survey available on our website at csrc.asu.edu/events, and your feedback is helpful for us with topics to consider, further questions that you may have. If you did like this talk, it is recorded. It is available on our YouTube channel. So give that a quick internet search and it will be there for you. For other information on our events, as John mentioned earlier, visit that same website, csrc.asu.edu/events. We would love to see you at our next event on April 20th for the Laid Bare series, which also approaches different understandings of how science and religion intersect with our reality, especially in this pandemic time. If you'd like talks like this, consider making a donation to the center. Information on how to do so is available at csrc.asu.edu/support. Thank you all so much again, and we hope to be in touch. Thank you once again, Professor Jewett. And with that, we will sign off for the afternoon. Take care, everyone.